The notary had a small scar on his left thumb, shaped like a fishhook. I remember staring at it while he spread the documents across Grandma Celestine's kitchen table, the same table where she had taught me to roll pierogi dough at 4 in the morning, the same table where she'd once arm-wrestled my Uncle Dariush and won. The document said she was transferring the house at 14 Wiersboa Street to my parents for the sum of $1. My mother's signature was already on the page. My father was uncapping his pen, and Grandma Celestine was standing at the kitchen window, watching starlings on the power line, as if none of this concerned her at all. That was the image I couldn't shake. Not the pen. Not the dollar. Her stillness. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New. I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to tell you the exact amount of money involved, the name of the document that saved her, and what she said to me the last time I saw her that I didn't understand until it was too late to thank her for it. If this is your first time here, subscribe before we go further. This channel is about quiet people who outlast loud ones, and justice, when it arrives, tends to arrive on its own schedule. My name is Marta Szymanska-Kurel. I'm a civil engineer. I've spent 15 years designing drainage systems for municipalities across southern Poland. The infrastructure nobody photographs, the work that keeps basements dry during storms nobody predicted. I own a 2-room apartment in Wrocław. I bought it at 28 with money I saved by eating bread and lard for 6 months while colleagues went to restaurants. I say this not to boast but to establish what is relevant. I have never needed anything from my family that my family was not willing to give freely, which is how I knew that the one person in that family who deserved better was getting worse. Grandma Celestine was 81. She had outlived one husband, 2 wars in living memory, and the bureaucratic collapse of an entire economic system. She lived alone at 14 Wiersboa Street in the village of Strzegum, in a house she and my grandfather had built themselves over 3 summers. She tended a garden that produced 7 varieties of tomato, and a climbing rose that had survived every winter since 1974. She was not frail. She was not confused. She was, by any clinical measure, sharper than most people I've worked with in government contracting. My parents called her difficult. My uncle called her stubborn. What they meant was that she did not defer to them, and they found that intolerable in an old woman. I visited her every month. I drove 2 hours each way, usually arriving Friday evening and leaving Sunday after dinner. She would have a pot of Zurek soup on the stove when I arrived, the same sour rye base she'd been cooking since before my mother was born, and we would sit at that kitchen table and talk about her tomatoes and my drainage projects and the starlings she'd been watching for 40 years. She once told me that the same families of starlings come back each year. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't care. I wrote it down. The invitation arrived in March. My parents were hosting Easter at their house in Katowice, and my mother called to say Grandma Celestine would be there, which meant I should come. The conditions were attached as a postscript. My mother mentioned, in the same breath as the menu, that they were finally dealing with the house situation, that Celestine was getting on in years, and it was irresponsible to leave an old woman managing a property alone, that the plan was simply to transfer the deed, for tax purposes, she said, and that a notary would be present after dinner, and it would all be very quick. I asked if Grandma Celestine had agreed to this. She's agreed to discuss it, my mother said. I heard the difference. I asked if Celestine had her own legal representation. A pause. It's a family matter. I drove to Katowice on Holy Saturday. In my bag, I had a printed copy of the Polish Civil Code provision on undue influence in property transfers and a photograph of Grandma Celestine at my engineering school graduation. She was the only family member who'd made the 4-hour round trip for a ceremony my parents called a bit much for a Friday. I brought both out of habit, the way I bring my own calculations to a site inspection even when I've been told everything is already verified. The irony, which I did not recognize until much later, the photograph was the smaller thing in the bag. The provision wasn't the most important document either. I just didn't know it yet. Dinner was ham and borscht and a poppy seed roll that my mother had bought, not baked, though she accepted compliments on it without correcting anyone. Grandma Celestine sat at the far end of the table. She ate slowly. She spoke when spoken to and not otherwise. At one point my Uncle Dariush told a long story about a property deal he'd made in Gdansk, and at the end of it Grandma Celestine said, "Congratulations on the money you found that didn't belong to you." And the table went quiet and my uncle laughed because he didn't know what else to do. She caught my eye across the table. Her expression did not change. But her hand moved, just once, to touch the small embroidered bag she kept at her hip, the one she'd carried for as long as I could remember. I'd never seen inside it. I thought it held her rosary. The notary arrived at 8:30. He sat up at the kitchen table. He laid out the documents. He explained the transfer. His voice was professionally neutral. Grandma Celestine stood at the window. My father said, "Mama, come sit down." She didn't move. My mother said, "Celestine, we've talked about this." "You talked," Celestine said. I listened. My uncle said the notary was being paid by the hour. I said, "Has anyone explained to her what she's signing?" My father looked at me. "Stay out of this, Marta. She's my grandmother. She's our mother." The notary cleared his throat. He explained again. $1. Deed transfer. My mother's name on the document, my father's, and the address. 14 Wiersboa Street, Strzegom. I said, "Grandma, you don't have to sign anything." My mother said, "Marta." I said it again. "You do not have to sign anything." My father stood up. He was not a man who raised his voice. He had subtler tools, but he stood up and he said very quietly that if I could not be respectful of a family decision then perhaps I should wait in the car. I looked at Grandma Celestine. She was still at the window. She said without turning, "Go, Marta. Take your bag." Her voice was calm. It was also a specific kind of calm, the kind that comes after the work is done, not before it begins. I said, "I'm not leaving without you." She finally turned from the window. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her embroidered bag, held it against her side, and walked to the door. My father said she would regret this. She said, "I know what regret feels like today, Aush. This isn't it." We drove back to Strzegom that night, 2 hours in almost total silence. She fell asleep in the passenger seat before we reached the highway. I kept the heat at 22 degrees because she'd once mentioned she was always cold in cars. When we arrived, she went inside without ceremony. I carried her bag in. She took it from me at the threshold carefully, the way you carry something that has weight you don't want to drop. I arranged my life accordingly after that. I drove to Strzegom every weekend from March through the following January. I brought groceries, which she accepted without comment on the cost, and tools for the garden, which she accepted with detailed instructions on where to put them. I repaired a section of guttering on the east side of the house that had been rusting since at least 2019. The parts cost 340 zloty. The latter I borrowed from her neighbor, Pan Francisek, who was 84 and had been trying to court Celestine since approximately 1987. My parents called twice in April. They presented the transfer again, this time framed as an inheritance planning measure. They said the house was costing Celestine money she didn't have. They said they only wanted to protect her. I handed the phone to Grandma Celestine. She listened for approximately 40 seconds and then said, "I'll think about it," and handed the phone back to me, and we never discussed it further. In June, my Uncle Dariush drove to Strzegom unannounced with a revised document and a bottle of wine as a gift. Grandma Celestine accepted the wine. She did not open the document. She served him tea and a slice of apple cake she'd made that morning. She rose at 5:30 to start the dough, a habit from decades of having a family to feed, and she listened to everything he said, and when he was done she said, "Thank you for coming, Dariush. Drive carefully." He left with the document still rolled in his hand. Afterward she went back to her garden. I watched her through the kitchen window, moving between the tomato stakes with a deliberateness that looked, from a distance, like prayer. The embroidered bag sat on the shelf above the kitchen table. It was always there. It was always closed. Once I noticed it had been moved, just slightly, the pattern facing inward instead of out, and I had the irrational feeling that it was heavier than it should have been. I said nothing. It was not my business. She didn't talk much about the future. But in July she said something I filed under old woman things I didn't understand. "The house knows who owns it, Marta. Houses remember. If you're watching this and wondering whether she was going to be alright, if you're sitting somewhere right now hoping this story goes where you need it to go, subscribe so the rest of it finds you. Because what happened next is the part one still think about when I can't sleep. Grandma Celestine died in November. A stroke swift in her sleep. Pan Francisek found her in the morning when she didn't come out to check the frost on her roses. I drove to Strzegum and I walked through every room. I watered the climbing rose. I stood at the kitchen table and I put my hands flat on the surface and I let myself feel the particular quality of a room that has had its person removed from it. On the shelf, the embroidered bag was still there. Inside it, her rosary as I'd assumed. 2 photographs I'd never seen, one of my grandfather, one of a young woman I didn't recognize until I looked carefully and realized it was Celestine herself, perhaps 19, standing in front of a house under construction, and a sealed envelope, addressed in her handwriting to a law firm in Wrocław. I delivered it by hand. The meeting was in February, at the offices of Kancelaria Prana Witkowska I Spalnicy, on the 4th floor of a building on Ul. Swidnica. My parents were there. My uncle Dariusz was there. A junior associate at the firm had called them each personally, and told them only that it concerned the estate of Celestine Szymanska, and that their presence was required. The attorney's name was Pani Renata Witkowska. She was 60, unhurried, and had the specific quality of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it has become a form of precision work. She explained that Grandma Celestine had visited her offices in January of the previous year, 2 months before the Easter dinner, 2 months before the notary with the fishhook scar on his thumb, and had executed a comprehensive estate plan. The house at 14 Wierzboa Street, valued at current market rate at 480,000 zloty, had been placed in a legal trust. The trust named a single beneficiary. The trust could not be altered, transferred, or contested by any family member, because Grandma Celestine had been evaluated by a licensed psychiatrist on the same day she signed the documents, a formality she had specifically requested, and had been declared in writing to be in full cognitive and legal capacity. She had also, Pani Witkowska said, left a written statement to be read aloud. My mother's hands went flat on the table. My uncle's mouth opened and did not close. My father looked at the window. His jaw worked once like a man trying to find a door in a wall he'd been sure had one. Pani Witkowska read the statement. It was 2 pages. It was methodical and precise, and it named the Easter dinner specifically, the notary, the $1 transfer, the pressure applied in front of a family that did not intervene. It named the April phone calls. It named Dariusz's unannounced visit and the bottle of wine he'd brought and the document he'd left with. It also named me. It said, my granddaughter Marta drove 2 hours every month without being asked. She repaired the guttering on the east side of the house. She stayed. This is not a small thing. Most people leave. My mother said, this isn't legal. Pani Witkowska said, it is in fact entirely legal. You're welcome to retain your own counsel. My uncle said, she was confused. She was alone. She didn't understand what she was doing. Pani Witkowska slid a document across the table. The psychiatric evaluation. 14 pages. The psychiatrist's conclusion occupied 1 sentence on page 14. Subject demonstrates no cognitive impairment, no susceptibility to undue influence, and full understanding of the legal and financial implications of her decisions. My uncle looked at it. His face changed. Not into anger, into something smaller. I noticed it and I did not use it. My mother began to cry. It was the performance kind, the kind where the shoulders move but the eyes stay watchful, and I had seen it enough times in my life to recognize it and feel nothing but a mild professional interest in its mechanics. I reached into my bag. I placed the embroidered cloth bag on the table. I'd brought it from the shelf at Wierzboa Street, the morning I found the envelope. It was the last thing of hers I had. I said, she told me the house knows who owns it. She said houses remember. I said, she said that in July. She knew in January that you'd try in April. She was 11 months ahead of you the entire time. I said it quietly. I did not add anything else. I didn't need anything else. The trust was administered without further contest. The house at 14 Wierzboa Street transferred to me, as Celestine's named beneficiary in March. My parents filed one preliminary objection with a solicitor in Katowice. The solicitor reviewed the documentation and declined to pursue it. The filing cost them, I was told, 1,800 zloty in consultation fees. I wrote to my parents once in April and told them that I would be willing to sit down with them if they wanted to speak about the estate directly, without lawyers, as a family. My mother replied that she needed time. My father did not reply. I filed the letter and did not follow up. I had made the offer. That was sufficient. I did not sell the house. I rent it now to a young couple from Wrocław, Agata and Piotr, who are teachers and who have already repainted the kitchen, at a rent that is below market because the market rate would have required that I become someone Celestine would not have recognized. Pan Franciszek still lives next door. He is 85. He tends the climbing rose in winter because he says someone has to, and he is correct, and I have stopped arguing with him about it. I go to Strzegim once a month. I sit at a different table now. There is a cafe in the village that serves Zurek on Fridays, but I bring my own calculations out of habit. And before I leave, I walk past 14 Wierzboa Street. I look at the east guttering I repaired. It still holds. Last month, Agata had planted something new along the south wall. Small green, just starting. I didn't stop to ask what it was. I didn't need to know yet. I just noted that something was growing there and kept walking. The house knows who owns it. She was right about that. She was right about most things, and I'm still catching up. Quiet people outlast loud ones. That's not a comfort, it's a discipline. It requires showing up when it's inconvenient, repairing what's rusting, staying when everyone else has decided that leaving is easier. If there's someone in your life who keeps the table set and tends the garden and isn't sure anyone notices, notice. Tell them today. Not tomorrow. Today. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me who your Celestine is. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.